Okay, so on today's episode of Complete Guide to Building Muscle, we are delving into the glutes, the booty, and we're throwing it over to Sue to take us through some of the anatomy and function of said peachy glutes. Go for it, Sue.
Yeah. So I'm going to be going through just kind of the different parts of the glutes and some things to keep in mind within the glutes. So there are three main parts of the glutes. There's a few other things that could definitely be considered or talked about, and we might touch on them, but I'm going to talk about the glute max, the glute med, and the glute minimus. So the glute maximus is the largest part of the glute muscle. It's also going to be the most superficial. So that's going to be producing the most shape of your booty, as Simon put. And the glute med is going to be fan shaped. So we talked about the back and the chest also being fan shaped. So you can go back and listen to those podcast episodes, shameless plug. But it's going to be fan shaped and it lies between the glute max and the glute minimus. And it's similar in shape and function to the glute minimus. So the glute minimus is deepest and the smallest of the superficial glute muscles and is similar shape and function to the glute med. So with that, keeping in mind that there's those three parts and then talking through some of those. So the glute max is going to be the main extensor of the thigh. So it assists in lateral rotation and it's really only used when force is required, such as running or climbing. And so you need to keep that in mind as well. For the glute med, it's going to abduct and medially rotate the lower limb. And also the glute med and the glute minimus secure the pelvis. So that is going to prevent that pelvic drop with the opposite limb. And like I said, with the glute minimus, it's going to secure the pelvis and then abduct and medially rotate as well.
Perfect. Awesome. So one question coming straight off the back of that, which I think that, again, like putting myself maybe in the listener's shoes so I can ask some dumb questions without judgment. When you get like muscles like you described there, where you've got one muscle that's more superficial versus the other, and they're kind of all in this one group of muscles. Do you approach training in any specific way to target one or try to bias one of those more than the other? Or is it pretty much a case when you go to do glute exercises, you are pretty much training them all of the time, barring maybe some finer tuning exercises, let's say?
Yeah, I would say for me personally, when it comes to programming, especially if a client has a problem initiating glutes or anything like that, I'm focusing more on that than confusing them and being like, we're really working the glute max here. And they'll be like, okay, what is that? And I know Instagram swipe videos, because they've become popular. It's been like, oh, your outer glute or your lower glute or your upper glute, or trying to get that booty shelf. But I would say more of a focus for me personally is making sure the client can get tension in their glutes. And with something that is going to, with the glutes as a whole, the biggest thing is body positioning that we really need to look at, because oftentimes someone will say like, oh, that's a glute exercise, but clients feel like they can't feel it in their glutes. And so it's really setting up the execution to make sure we get tension in our glutes before I get into the specifics of, hey, let me program to get this specific part of your glute initiated, at least for me personally with my clientele.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so
I would just add that simple execution is the biggest thing. A lot of people can't even contract their glutes to begin with, so we've got to get them in a position where they can actually create tension and then go from there.
Yeah, I think like obviously when we go into the anatomy, I just want people listening maybe not to get carried away with getting into, okay, it's these three muscles. So there must be some way of targeting this. I mean, some people may even, like when you talk about biceps and things like that, go a little bit overboard trying to target, building peaks and all that sort of stuff, when actually a lot of people just starting out just need to get that muscle moving and working rather than go too far into the detail and into the weeds, I guess. Cool. So next question then is, we know the anatomy and function. So when it comes to choosing some exercises, when you're programming for clients, are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or however many exercises that you like to use most often?
We can there's a list of movements, I suppose. I would say that depending on the individual and their mechanics in terms of each movement. I think the barbell back squat is a fantastic movement. The barbell hip thrust can be useful. The leg press, a split squat, a lunge, which you could put split squat and lunge in the same category, I suppose. But those would be kind of I don't know how many I named, 4 or 5 that I would start with to create a lot of tension in the glutes.
Mm-hmm. And more recently, there's been this the study that's come out of Brazil, I believe, where they've looked at comparing the barbell back squat with the hip thrust in terms of its effect on being able to stimulate more muscle growth in the glutes. And their specific conclusion, I think, was, to paraphrase, basically that the back squat is superior to the hip thrust for hypertrophy of the glute. Now, obviously, you've got guys like Brett Contreras, who's very much like a hip thrust type guy, and things like that. I don't know if any of you have looked at that or kind of have any opinions on whether that is surprising or just exactly what you expected from a comparison of those two particular types of exercise.
I'll start off with just
okay.
Sorry.
Austin
will start off, actually.
Okay. I just want to say really quick that the biggest thing looking at that study in reference to what's applicable and what we can use within training itself is just think about the range of motion that there's tension in general. So the squat has a much, much greater range of motion where there's tension being placed on the glutes, especially mechanically. And then the hip thrust just has a smaller range of motion that there's tension placed, especially at a peak state on the glutes, mainly at that top position. So I'll allow Sue to just take it over, but I just wanted to kind of say that in the beginning. Think of tension being placed on muscles based off the mechanics. So it may not always be a feeling or a sensation that you're feeling in terms of, oh, this is now working, because mechanically, I mean, if you're hip hinging, your glutes have to be hopefully doing something, or maybe your adductors are taking over because your glutes aren't doing much. But if everything's functioning correctly, as soon as we kind of go into that hip flexion position and go into a squat or an RDL pattern or anything like that, we're going to be using a significant amount of the glutes. So just think about range of motion, where tension would be placed. And obviously the squat has the greatest range of motion there relative to the hip thrust.
Yeah. And I think that's an absolute awesome point. And especially going off of that, talking about what range of motion that's actually hitting. So even though the squat has a greater range of motion and there's more to move through than with the hip thrust is going to hit the glutes in a more shortened position than the squat can. So that's something else to take in mind. But the note I was going to make was just from research in general. So when it comes to research, I think that when these types of studies come out, it's very much so okay, this is going to rock my world. I need to completely change my thought process. And now I need to only program squats because this research study said it was better than hip thrusts. But I think taking the personal component into it, as well as looking more in depth about research. So research definitely can move our level of understanding. It can shift. And I think it's important to read through research and to compile kind of your thought process, because we've learned from different documentaries that anyone can cherry pick the research studies that affirm what they want to affirm. But it's also important to take into consideration that research studies are based on average results, meaning that it's hard to reflect personal things, and it's hard to reflect reality perfectly because you're in a very controlled environment, which is great for trying to say the one thing you're trying to say, but it's also something that life isn't always a controlled environment. And if we're looking at research and someone says, okay, the squat is going to work your glutes more, well, what people did they have in that research study, and do you reflect those people? So for example, I have a client and it's extremely hard for her to do a squat that's glute focused or glute or hamstring focused because of the way her limb lengths are. Almost every time she does a squat, it is just quad, quad, quad. So the squat might not be the best glute exercise for her. That doesn't mean that it can't help other people build glutes. So that's something that I try to, whenever a new research study comes out or whenever someone's talking about something that's very popular on the fitness Instagram space or just in general. And again, especially because the hip thrust and Brett Contreras has made it very much so like this is the ultimate glute builder. And then for it to be the squat, it's like, well, why even do the hip thrust? But it's important to look at how you are progressing within it and looking at research alongside anecdotal, not throwing one or the other out, but looking at them side by side.
Yeah, I think it's a really great point because it applies to the nutrition side of things as just as much as it does the training side of things. So when I went through MNU, one of the things that they talk about right up front is the definition of what evidence-based actually means. And it's not just exclusively looking at research and only research. It's also using your experience as a practitioner in real world situations to be able to take that research and understand it and then apply it to real people and real situations. Because like you say, a particular study, whether it's an exercise one or a nutrition one, might have had to been done in a very specific way that might not translate that well to real life. So you've got to kind of take learning points from that and then apply that. And I think the thing that I kind of thought about when I looked at kind of a lot of some of the responses, like the reaction videos that people do, there are some that are very much like, clearly they don't like Brett Contreras when you watch what they had to say. But for me, it's like, well, again, like real world practical situation, no one's holding a gun to someone's head and saying you have to pick one or the other. And it's like, well, okay, I can do squats if it's mechanically good for me to do squats and that's going to build glutes. I don't have to then just ditch the hip thrust because one particular study said, okay, it's marginally less beneficial. I can do both if I want to. And I think as well, for beginners where maybe for them, a barbell back squat is quite a skill-based movement that they probably need to learn through various different progressions. Maybe a hip thrust for them when they first start out is actually going to be slightly better for them. And until they develop that skill and that ability to barbell back squat safely and effectively, maybe that's the route that they should go down. So I think, like you say, Sue, is you get the research, you get this group of people that were expert squatters and things like that, they had this result. But does that directly apply to you and your mechanics, your skill level, what you're trying to achieve? And you don't have to pick and choose like it's either one or the other. You get the full spectrum of exercises to pick from. And therefore, individualizing it for you is always the key thing, I think.
Yeah, 100%.
I had one thing to mention before Alex goes here. So think of a little bit about volume allocation as well. So if you're thinking about programming something in, I think it's also important to realize kind of what muscles are working during what movements the most. And so I think of it in the sense of, so let's compare something I would say is quite similar in let's look at a dumbbell bench press and a cable chest fly, for example, and make the comparison with the barbell back squat and the hip thrusts. So the squat itself trains the glutes and the quads very well, depending on your mechanics, obviously, but overall, those are the two muscle groups it trains very well. And similarly with the dumbbell bench press, that trains the chest and the triceps very well. So two different muscle groups. But if we look at the hip thrust, that trains, that's going to, depending on your execution, that's the main tension there is going to be on the glutes. And if you're looking at the cable fly, the main tension is going to be on the chest without the triceps involved. And similarly with the hip thrust, the quads, again, if execution is where it should be, the quad shouldn't be very involved in that movement. So, and I don't think anyone would get their panties in a wad if we told them that it's probably smart to do chest press and cable flies, right? So at the end of the day, I just think understanding and making comparisons and not looking at things in a vacuum is extremely important. And to look at people's beliefs on, again, upper body training, I don't think they would have even batted an eye, or we wouldn't even be talking about this on the podcast really if that would have come out, right? Because there isn't as much emotionally tied in to that. And to be honest, people haven't staked their entire careers on the dumbbell bench press or the cable fly itself. So, I mean, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. I think everyone has contributed a lot to what we now think of as beneficial programming and beneficial exercises. But at the end of the day, we got to take the rounded approach and look at the bigger picture of everything.
Agreed.
I think the first thing to add is that these Brazilian women were jacked. I mean, they were squatting, like the baseline was 220 pounds for their back squat. I don't remember what the hip thrust was, but they were squatting a lot of load.
That's as much as Alex squats.
I know, it's the exact same actually. And there were some girls that were getting like 12 to 14 repetitions with it. So it's like craziness. I mean, with what they were able to achieve. So I think that that's part of it too, is that they like my theory, part of it is that they've probably been squatting longer than they've been hip thrusting. And so their ability from an execution perspective is probably a little bit better. That's very nuanced add-on, but I think that it's important to note. And another thing to add is that they both showed growth, and Austin alludes to it, where it's going to be beneficial to program both and not just thinking that one is going to be better and you're going to only do that movement on every single session. Like the implementation of both is there. It's just smart programming that we need to utilize.
Yeah. And Alex even talking about them being good at squatting and knowing how to do that goes back to me even talking about if you can initiate that movement. So last night, actually, I was going over a new client with Alex, kind of talking through the best protocol to put in place because there was a lot of moving parts and I just needed to chalk through it. And he was like, I think that might be too much volume. And I was like, I thought so too, but I wasn't sure because I don't think she can even contract those muscles. So I don't think it's actually going to be too much volume. We'll see in a week when she reports back, but it was something where you have to take that into consideration when looking at these research studies. It's very easy to read the abstract and be like, here's my thought process on it. But I think it's really cool once you learn how to read a research study, and maybe that would be a cool video for physique development to make, is how to read through a research study to truly form an opinion instead of just reading the abstract or the conclusion and then forming your opinion.
100%. I think like often, you know, getting access to the full paper is sometimes quite difficult. There are ways to do it. But I think that that's the first thing, is that you literally, like you said, you can read in an abstract, maybe surface level stuff that you need to get under the skin of. I think I haven't actually read Brett's response to the study, but I know it's out there somewhere.
It's in Alan Aragon's research review if you want to find it.
Yeah, so I think that he'd said something about he thought that the hip thrust for most people is usually you can shift more weight on a hip thrust than you can on your barbell back squat, and he thought
depending on your execution, yeah,
and he thought it was strange that they were not that way around.
Right. And he used a lot of anecdotal experience from his clients and things of that nature, which he has incredible, you know, transformations and things like that. And he uses a lot of that in his kind of rebuttal to it. So, I mean, from an experience perspective, he has obviously reasoning to believe that the hip thrust would be more advantageous.
Cool. Moving on from Mr. Contreras, or actually maybe not moving on from Mr. Contreras. So specifically with this muscle group, like pump exercises and like high rep burnout type movements, and maybe like little supersets and trisets and things that like that are very popular. So you think like frog pump, I know that's another Brett Contreras thing, but like you'll see a lot of I'm going to say women, but like glute kickbacks and things like that. How important do you feel is that sort of quote unquote pump work to developing glutes? Is it something that people should be looking to do, or is it maybe like, yeah, it's not really doing that much?
I think it has its place. I think that Brett also made a good post talking about glutes in regards to some of that, where someone said, if you want a glute burn, then get a band and do exercises nonstop for 3 minutes. If you want sore glutes, then do 100 walking lunges and then wait a day. And if you want to grow your glutes, then stop worshiping the burn and the pump and the soreness and train intelligently. And I think that was great that he made that post, because he does make a lot of posts about like a booty pump or a booty burn. But a lot of times within glutes, even a problem is that people, since they are like praise the burn and the pump, and they don't think about the actual training of it. And that's with a lot of muscles, is that people will be pump chasers or will just be going to feel a burn. And oftentimes people take the burn or the sensation and confuse that with actual tension being put on the muscle. And so being able to see, okay, there can be a time and place for that. It's not like I'm telling you never to get a pump or you should never feel a burn while you're training, but being able to not just worship the pump and the burn and recognize that they do have their time and place. And there's also a time and place for training intelligently, which is basically all the time. You should always train smart.
Don't praise the pump. That's what we're saying.
Yeah. Sue crushed that. Yeah.
Thanks.
So we talked a little bit about execution of like hip thrusts and things like that. Have you got for any particular exercise that you maybe favor, any particular cues or tips or things that people can kind of have in their minds to help execute those exercises more effectively and feel it in the glutes, create tension in the glutes where it needs to be? Don't know who wants.
How much time you got?
As long as you like.
What movement would we like to start with? We could.
Let's go. Squats and hip thrust. I guess they're the two like main ones that people probably focus in on. So maybe that's a good place to start.
Yeah, I think that something that's kind of overarching across all movements is just going to be taking your time within the movement, spending time in the extremes. For example, with the barbell back squat, spending time in the bottom position, where you're going to be most heavily loaded and not just sitting there like resting, more so actually creating tension in the glutes and spending time there. From an execution perspective, I would encourage an individual to start the movement with tension in their glutes, so contracting their glutes and then driving their hips back would be the first thing to start with, while maintaining that tension on their glutes as they descend into the squat is going to be pivotal for them to potentially have a good amount of tension created in their glutes. Yeah, I feel like I can take this super deep, or I could kind of stay more surface level. I don't know.
Okay.
I would say with a lot of exercises is to really film yourself. That's going to be with any body part, but with Alex talking about the squat, and I'll have him go back and talk about the hip thrust. I don't just want to cut him off there. But within the squat, oftentimes when I get videos from clients, they'll be like, I'm not feeling it in my glutes. They're breaking at the knees and the bar path is in a place. And I have a video, or Physique Development has a video talking about where the weight is furthest from the joint and what's going to be actually getting the tension there. So with Alex talking about really getting that tension in your glutes and pushing that back, taking a video and seeing, okay, where are my glutes at in this movement? Where is the bar in this movement? Where are my knees in this movement? And how does that work together to really make sure I'm hitting where I need to? And also with videoing yourself, you can see if your heels are coming off or your toes are coming off, if you have a butt wink, anything like that. And really being able, and I encourage all of my clients as they send me videos and as I talk through them, I say, pull it up and watch this as I'm talking through it. Because me talking through it and saying it is very easy for you to nod your head and be like, yeah, I'll work on that. But you seeing it, then re-recording yourself and seeing if you did the same thing is also a really important part. And especially with glute training, with the hip thrust, with the squat, it's something where it's just a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of bodily things moving. And so being able to watch that and kind of zone in on that is important.
Cool. And you mentioned butt wink there. What's your view on, should people be avoiding it, trying to work around it? I see, you'll see people, again, like people that are quite well known, just go straight through it and not care about it. So what's kind of your view on the best way for people listening maybe to approach that?
I would say oftentimes the butt wink comes from your range of motion being too large. And a lot of people try to just be like, let me get ass to grass, let me get my butt to the floor. And that's what the movement is. And as we talked about in the hamstring video, oftentimes with the RDL, people are just like, let me get my hands to my toes. And it's not just a point A to point B, it's looking at the tension that's happening in between. So oftentimes when I see that in a client, I'll say shorten your range of motion and end before where that butt wink butt wink is, and really be able to push through that movement instead of just thinking, let me get my butt down and my butt up. You're thinking about the movement as a whole. So really encouraging people to think through, okay, why is that happening? Then let's stop a little bit short of it and really try to push through our glutes to finish the movement instead of just, let me get it from point A to point B.
I think another thing too is understanding what compensation in general is, and understanding what your overall goal is with it, and kind of how you're approaching this exercise. So I say that, like, are you a power lifter? Do you have predetermined depths and rules basically dictating what this movement needs to look like, and how you're going to be judged on the success of this movement? So I think we see a lot of this movement, through strength and powerlifting means, and people have these predetermined depths where that is a destination sport. And so that needs to be taken into context. And so if your goal is strictly physique development and body composition changes, then I think honestly the biggest thing is staying within your means and staying within your training range of motion, and what can be utilized and active during the execution of that movement itself. And so there are limitations with the people's mechanics, and that is fine. That's not a juke to you at all. And it depends on your lever links and your mechanics and all of that. But the butt wink is, that is a hard one to say. The butt wink is a compensation. So things are, other than your glutes, for example, are starting to take over. And basically once you hit that point below, until you get back to the point where your glutes can take back over and your mechanics can pick back up, I don't know where that tension's going, and neither do you. And that's where a lot of people see lower back injuries, and where they see those erectors take over and other musculature around the hip, which there is a lot around the hip and the pelvis. So, and a lot of small ones that aren't meant. It's a lot like the shoulder in the way where there's a lot of very, very small muscle groups that are there for a reason, but they're not meant to take the blunt load of a barbell back squat or anything like that. So understand that that's a compensation, and understand if who you're looking up to has it. I would ask or try and see why they're doing it. Are they in a sport that basically requires it, and go from there? But I think it's very smart to stop short of it and work within a range of motion that works for you.
100%. Cool. Let's go back to Alex then and talk about hip thrusts.
So for hip thrust, I think that there's a couple of things, especially from a setup position, that people run into. I think that the box height or the bench height is something that many people run into. So having a bench that allows for you to kind of rest right under the teres or kind of on that lower trap is going to be huge. And then having some support against that bench, because when you are utilizing that bench as an opposing force for you to really generate force through the glutes, oftentimes that bench will tip over or something of that nature. So you want to have it pressed up against the wall or have something stable for you to have. And then I guess the next thing from there would be to make sure that foot positioning is good, the ankle and the knee joint are in alignment. I think that something that people run into quite frequently is just kind of like creating so much momentum out of the bottom, and then it becomes this kind of like what I would consider like a wave. Essentially, it's just like all over the place of just like crazy momentum being generated and not a whole lot of glute being utilized. So being in a more controlled environment, spending a little bit more time, like I've said, and the lengthened and the shortened position in terms of the extremes, and just being a little bit more methodical within the execution in total.
We do have a full article on this on our site. Basically a step-by-step setup, execution, and common mistakes of the hip thrust. I did my best to kind of create a full breakdown of that setup, execution, and common mistakes. So if those listening, you're trying to kind of see it, see it through in your head. If you want it in text, and there's a picture by picture, step by step thing on how to set it up and execute it and avoid shit you shouldn't be doing, basically, to be taking tension away from your glutes, then I think the video or the article itself is a good resource.
Cool.
Yeah.
And we'll
another thing
put
with
in the
the
show notes for people as well. So
Yeah. Another thing with the hip thrust, I'll say was a huge game changer for me was keeping my torso short. Is that oftentimes I see people just drop their hips because they're thinking the barbell goes down, the barbell comes back up, but being able to keep your torso short and then really thinking about your knees not drifting back. Then when I tell clients that, or when I'm working with someone in person, then it comes like, well, then how do I move the bar? And it's like, well, then with your glutes. And it makes it a lot harder. And I had to start over once I like had to perfect my form. I had to go from hip thrusting way more to the bare minimum to be able to make sure that I was doing it the right way. And I've been able to move back up pretty quickly, in my opinion at least, and be able to actually control the glutes in a better way because I had to get that execution down. So you'll hear this through all of the podcasts that we're talking about certain muscle groups, is that the setup and the execution is the end all be all, because you could be doing an exercise and, like Austin said, compensation is normally what comes in and takes away. So you're compensating with other muscles, you're trying to take that, and then you end up doing these exercises that you're really not actually executing properly, and then you don't know why you're not progressing. And so really being able to break it down, back down to the setup, back down to the execution is going to be a big game changer for a lot of you.
Cool.
We're set up to be compensators. I'll say that. So if you look at athletes, if you look at, how our muscles would have evolved in general, like we're set up to compensate. In my opinion, there's a reason that many muscles have many functions and can do many things, is because they're there to help the other muscles go through a range of motion, or whether that's because we don't work in a fixed system. I'm not going forward up. Now I'm going to the side laterally up. Now I'm done with that. Now I'm going backward. Like, that's not how you move. You don't function that way. You function in basically infinite ways, in directions and ways that your muscles could work. So obviously we have main functions of muscles, but also there's the accessory functions of those muscles as well, and complementative to other movement patterns. So understanding that our bodies are really made to compensate. And if you look at athletes in general, athletes are made to compensate, and the best athletes are the best compensators. And so if you come from an athletic background, you also have to understand that your entire career up to this point has been built around compensating, especially within your sport specifically, especially if it's a dynamic sport. And so that needs to be kept in mind as well. And you may have to work backwards a bit. And I know all of us came from some type of sport. So you have to look at almost taking a few steps backward to refine things and understand things a bit better. There is going to be a period where your strength's going to take a hit, but once things click and once things start to make more sense and your mechanics starts to fix themselves because of the work you're doing with execution and setup, you're going to blow past your previous strength anyways. So because your muscles are actually working and you're working within a plane that things should be working in, you're not compensating as much, and those muscles themselves are getting significantly stronger, and et cetera. So I think that's a point to make as well.
100%.
Got it. So one more question from me, and I'm going to direct this to either one of the two guys. So you take your pick. So when we talk about glutes, obviously there's a natural thing where, it's a very much a high priority for many women. But in terms of guys, how much should guys specifically look at glute training as not just things females do? It's important for guys as well.
What do you think, Alex?
Well, restate the question.
So basically,
focusing on glute training is what you're saying?
So
how important is it that guys focus on glute training?
Yeah, because it's traditional. When people think of glute training, they instantly think of, maybe Insta girls and things like that, with their perfect butt cheeks and things like that. So many guys may shy away from actually specifically trying to train and grow their glutes. So is that necessarily a thing that they should try to avoid? Should it be part of their training to train glutes specifically?
Yeah, I absolutely think it should be part of their training. I think that what most guys will find is that girls find it fairly attractive for them to have built legs in general. I would imagine, or in my own experience, my wife is here, so she can kind of vocalize this. But I will say that it will. I mean, it has great carryover, obviously, to their squat and all the other lower body movements. So I think it's huge.
Yeah, and also looking at. Well, I'll let Sue compliment, his glutes at a later date. But from the standpoint also expanding on what Alex said, it's important in terms of lower body strength and looking at what the glutes help with, and that's hip flexion or massive hip extensors. And so obviously they aid in the eccentric portion of hip flexion and also help drive hip extension, which if you look at most lower body exercises, unless you're in a machine that is a single joint fixed knee position, which is basically the leg extension and leg curl variations and stuff like that, every other lower body movement is going to involve some sort of hip flexion and hip extension, which the glutes are a part of all of that. And so I think it's incredibly beneficial for men to train their glutes. And one thing that I wanted to mention earlier when I said volume allocation, and then I became myself and started going off on some other, thankfully, relevant topic, but the volume allocation of things as well, you have to look at, with my example of the barbell back squat and the hip thrust, if you're looking at the dumbbell bench press and the cable fly, for example, there may be a time where you look at your movement selection. So let's say that you're doing a ton of leg extensions within your programming, but you need to get some glute training in. Well, squat may not be the best option for you because squats still have a massive quad component to them. So this may be a good time to directly train your glutes with the hip thrust or something like that. So you have to kind of look at volume allocation that way as well. And, if I'm getting 30 sets a week on quads, whether it's with direct training or carryover training with other body parts or other movements, you may also want to think about and consider if you're only getting 4 sets directly with your glutes, shit, dude, we should probably increase the direct glute volume that we're doing. And I think that's where a lot of men tend to make mistakes as far as that goes. And yeah, I'll let Sue go just because I think she has something beneficial. And I'll shut up.
Well, it is true that, just a well-developed physique in general. We don't want to have too much focus on one body part at the end of the day. Of course, everyone has goals, and especially if you're in a physique-focused sport like bodybuilding where you have to grow certain muscles, or especially for different divisions, having a more focus on those muscles. But at the end of the day, training and having a balanced physique is going to be good for your health. And I think that that's what a lot of people forget when they get into these deeper conversations. It's just like, well, there's X, Y, and Z, and there's this, and that. But it's like, at the end of the day, we need all of our muscles functioning. They all have a function other than looking good. Yes, having nice capped shoulders looks good. Your shoulders have a function. Having nice glutes is great, but your glutes have a function. Do you want to be able to walk upstairs correctly? Yes, your glutes are going to help with that. Your glutes are going to be important in that. And then also talking about the inverse connection within your body of, if you don't train lower body at all, if you're a male or a female, or if you don't train your posterior of your lower body, that's going to cause complications for your anterior. And when I used to train in person, I was training my dad in person. I had him doing glute focused exercises, and he was a swimmer. So he never really ever trained his lower body. And since I've done his training, it's been a whole game changer because his lower body is actually having the function that it needs to be able to age well, actually, to be able to not have as many aches and pains aging. And he said something like, well, why am I trying to do this glute exercise? Or why am I trying to grow a big butt? I'm not trying to. And I had to go through and just be like, not only is this going to help with your muscle tone of your whole body, and if you're missing out on glutes, you're missing out on muscle that could burn more calories and you want to lose weight, but also to the fact of having strong glutes is going to support your lower back. It's going to help with all kinds of hip extension in general, and you are going to use hip extension in your day-to-day life. Your muscles need to work together, like Austin said, that we are compensators as a whole, but we need to be able to have each muscle working and then be able to work together. So they also are hip stabilizers. So we need to make sure we have alignment within our body as a whole. So being able to see it not just as like, oh, I want nice glutes or I want to look this way, but how well does my body function and how well is that going to help me, especially as I age, which is something that is so important. Something I find myself reiterating to clients is this is your health at the end of the day. Yes, there's that aesthetic portion, and that's why some people forget how much of your health this is. But like, and also in regards to nutrition, it's health. What is going to help you live a life that is going to be free of as many ailments as possible? And that's what you need to circle back on when it comes to, should I train this body part? You should train all of your body parts. You should. The volume allocation is going to be different, but you need to make sure you're not just not training something because you want your body functioning properly.
Very well said, Sue. I think because I think that in my head, I hope that guys do listen to this episode and hear not only what we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes, but specifically what you just said there about health and it not just being about aesthetics. Because I think there is a tendency when, for example, when I post this in the future, when it actually goes out and it will talk about glutes, I know that there will be quite a significant proportion of guys that won't click that because it's about glutes. And then there's this whole thing around, okay, well, that's just for women. But actually, like you said, it goes way beyond just aesthetics and how good you look in a pair of leggings and things like that. There's much more to it. So I do hope that guys actually look beyond the fact that maybe what they see on Instagram when everybody talks about glutes is kind of, there's more for you to think about than, okay, what do I look like? I don't really need this. So I think you said it perfectly and I just butchered it by adding a few sentences.
I think another thing to mention, I think as far as the way men are thinking, similar to my example earlier, think of you're only training your chest and you don't even things out with your upper back or any back training at all. Like obviously you're going to have incredible rounding at the shoulders. You're going to have your chest overpowering everything in terms of your overall, what am I looking for? Posture in general. So we all can see that that isn't a healthy thing either. And I think men would instantly change that. They would change their training to, okay, I need more back training because this obviously isn't healthy being all crunched over like an 80-year-old or 90-year-old person, right? So I think they would instantly kind of start to change that and evolve. And it's a similar thing with your lower body and your glutes, and understanding that similar to if we're looking at the upper body in terms of looking at just whether you're looking at muscles around your rib cage or scapula or whatever else, muscles around all of that functions together, right? Like we understand at this point, hopefully, that if you have overpowering abs and a weak low back, you're going to get lower back pain. Okay, if you have overpowering quads and anterior part of your body, you're going to get some pain in the posterior in terms of probably lower back pain, because all of these things are working in integration and pulling on the pelvis. And we have to have a good even ratio and strength within all of those muscles, similar to the upper body and lower body. So expanding on what Sue kind of mentioned there, hopefully if there are any men listening to this point, if Sue's example didn't really resonate with you, hopefully thinking in terms of the upper body resonates a little bit more with you.
Cool. Awesome. Cool. Great episode, guys. Lots of things for people to take away, practical information as usual they can put into their training and their lifestyles in general. I will put a link to the article that Austin mentioned earlier, and people can click that and then head off and have a look at hip thrust technique. But until next time, thank you very much, guys, and we will speak to you soon.
See you.
Peace out.
See ya.